Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on September the 14th, 2012. For newcomers as always, and I get this over at the beginning of the broadcast rather than pester you all the way through, I'd like to remind you that you're the audience that bring me to you. I don't bring on advertisers as guests that scare you then sell you things. And that gives me more leeway to talk honestly about certain things too. And also, it's up to you to say if you like what you're hearing on this particular broadcast. And lots of other guys copy the stuff that comes out from here and have kind of followed it for a long, long time. So, as I say, if you want to support me, you can help me keep ticking along by buying the books and discs at cuttingthroughthematrix.com. And you can also donate as well. Because most donations are really, really welcome at this time because we're going through austerity, you see. And most folk do get used to just at the TV, they click you on every night or the radio and there you are. And they think it's all taken care of by advertising or whatever. I've got no contact whatsoever to the advertisers that you hear advertising in the breaks in this broadcast. So it's nothing to do with me at all. And a great thank RBN for even putting this particular broadcast on. So, as I say, if you support me and keep me going, then we'll get more and more information out as time goes on in these weird times. And they really are incredibly weird times. And remember, too, from the US to Canada, you can still use personal checks or international postal money orders from the post office. You can use PayPal or you can send cash. And across the world, you've got Western Union, MoneyGram, and PayPal once again. And again, straight donations are really, really welcome. And what I do is just tie in information from the past to the present to show you the big boys that run the world. And you've got to really understand this very basic truth. And it is a truth. Government and governance is all about the future, controlling the present and setting up instruments to make sure that the future stays in the same hands of the same tiny dominant minority. That's how big corporations work too. They're always looking into 50 years down the road or more to make sure that there's where they'll be then, where they'll be, where they want to be, how they'll get there, how the competition will either be amalgamated with them or else they'll knock them out, because that's how business really is. And it's the same with government as well, dominant minorities. And the dominant minority we have today has been here for a long, long time, actually many centuries when you go back through history, starting with the British Empire, and then moving on through the world into the global empire. The US has taken over the torch, as you say, and they pay for most of the stuff now. The armies, the military, the taxes come from the people. They supply the bodies that go over to shoot or be shot and all of that kind of stuff. And you have to go into the histories, as I say, of the groups that formed at least came out in public, at least in the 1800s, and then into the 1900s, such as the Milner Group, a group of international bankers that got together, and they amalgamated with the Cecil Rhodes Foundation and Lord Rothschild's Foundation, and they established the Royal Institute for International Affairs, which sounds awfully governmental, but really they're private. They're a private organization with a government charter, a crown charter that's above government in the British Empire system. So, you understand, they set up to take over the whole world and manage all the people underneath them as we go through the big, massive changes. That's why you have all these neuroscientists and psychologists getting massive funding to find ways to control the people through their media, because the same boys own all of the media, up to the mainstream media. And they really mean business. I read an article today from Australia where one psychologist was getting well over $1 million, $1.5 million, so that he can censor the news, basically, what's real and what's not, what the public should hear. You know, the proper news, the authorized news. Back with more after this break. Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt, cutting through the matrix and talking about things as they really are. You understand, we're all under management perception, or perception management, as I like to call it. And that means total perception management. That's why you've been trained for many, many years through the regular media, even your weather stations, to bring on experts to tell you what to wear when it's raining and all that kind of stuff. Because experts rule your lives. And you've been training you just to obey the word expert. Somebody comes on, they're an expert, you don't question it and you go along with their point of view. After all, who are you at the bottom? obviously. And of course, Lord Bertrand Russell said this back in the 1940s and 50s, that we shall train the public to simply obey the academia and experts when they're presented to them. We're always being trained. And most folk will take opinions because they're guided to the conclusions. Just like a computer will come to certain conclusions. The programmer knows it. And the guy that designs it knows it too, because they don't know the program, they know this logic, and they know that it must run a certain logic to come to a certain conclusion. We're just the same. We're fed bits and bytes of information repetitively. It's constant over and over again. And repetition certainly makes it sink in. They always say in advertising that a lie told 1,000 times becomes the truth. And that's how we're bombarded all the time with all major points of view that we're supposed to believe in, you see. Now, the ones at the top know different stories. Of course, they know the higher realities of how things really are on every level, everything, in fact. Why things are really happening too. In fact, the job of government is really to find ways to lie to the public about pretty well everything. I hope you understand that. That's his job. It's always been that way, though. I mentioned that Francis Bacon mentioned that too a long time ago to the king with his form of resume as he was trying to get another job. And that's how they did it, just like Machiavelli. They wrote massive resumes to impress royalty so they'd be brought on as an advisor. Advisors are very important. Even more so today, perhaps. So perception management is a big, big, big science. And of course they bring in all the psychologists, neuroscientists, all these guys on to work with it. And they also put stuff into ads and so on television. Everything that's politically correct, you're getting upgraded to parrot and mimic and believe, you'll go ahead and do it without even thinking. Because everyone else, and especially in your own peer group, will go along at the same time with the new opinions and so on. Very simple stuff. And we are trained better than any other animal on the planet. Now, I've mentioned chemtrails often and the history of the chemtrails. I've gone on to Teller before, the guy who invented the H-bomb, and how he not only was into chemtrails, he wanted to associate chemtrails not just with weather modification, but he also with using electromagnetic frequency waves, what I call it HARP technology. Which it can interact with these metallic particles in the air that they spray and alter the weather. And he wanted it for warfare purposes. And I've got a few articles here about some of the things to do with that because it's so prevalent. Just the last few days I've watched the skies which were temporarily blue. Temporarily for years, because before that you get the white mush. And I've read the fact that the guys in geoengineering say, yeah, if they do it, they'll get white mush. And that's what you end up, these whitish skies. But there's a few weeks of blue for there, and bang, I knew something was going to happen. They've altered the stuff. They're putting on heavier than ever before, and they're building up a storm, and it broke today, and came that really black clouds as it was spraying away. And it was like a monsoon. You don't get normal rain now, you get monsoons. A lot of rain falls in a few hours, way more than it used to. The weather is completely manipulated, not just in Canada or the States, but across the world. And as they do this, again, perception management comes into play because they must normalize what you're seeing so that you'll think, oh, well, and they come out with the contrail stuff. Oh, that's condensation and all the rest of it. And I love this one. It came out in the Telegraph newspaper, the photographs of the week type thing. And you see this mess over London. And they're normalizing chemtrails into contrails now. You see, we're back to contrails. Just to get you used to that. So that when someone says chemtrails, immediately, oh no, they're contrails, you see. And I'll put this link up tonight so you can see the mush over London yourself, which is pretty well the mush over me. I only have a tiny wee airport to the north of me, and it only gets about 4 or maybe even 3 or even 2 flights per day, mainly from Texas, because they come up to do with the mining in Sudbury, the big boys. Now, I'll put that one up. And also, I'll put up one to do with, it's called Stolen Skies. And it's quite interesting. It's written by William Thomas. Now, William Thomas is a kind of greeny type guy. And I think he works for the United Nations Department at one point in the field type thing. But he does good follow-ups to what's happening in the sky. And he talks about how the jet trails in the sky used to disappear, but now they linger. In fact, they stay and they widen, in fact, to merge with other trails that they're laying. And he goes through a story to do what happened, I think in British Columbia, Canada, to a guy who saw this stuff happening back in the 90s, I think, or year 2000. And he couldn't believe what he was seeing. And that's how it is when it first started. If you were aware or conscious at all before it all started, about 98 or so, you saw it. It was night and day. It was like walking a science fiction movie, walking outside, because it didn't happen like that before. It was so sudden. But anyway, he complained, this guy who saw it in BC, and he complains to different agencies out there too. And eventually he got it from some answer from the military out in Canada, in British Columbia, who told him that they were not doing a military exercise. However, he'd been told already from another organization that there was a military exercise. So the Canadian military negated that and says, no, there's no military exercise. At least not in their records. So who was doing it? Someone was doing it, you see. And he goes through the story of this guy, as I say, who checked up and checked to try to find what really was going on. And he was told that, this is Terry Astute, the manager of planning and environment, the Victoria International Airport, responded to callers complaining about the strange patterns of circles and grids being woven over the British Columbia capital. Stewart left a message on his answering machine tape, a message that was later heard by more than 15 million radio listeners. And Stewart explained it's a military exercise, you see. He says, and Canadian Air Force exercise that's going on. But then he says, he called Comox, which is the Canadian Forces base on Vancouver Island. It says Canada's biggest radar installation. And it's easily capable of tracking the U.S. formations coming up from the south. When asked for a response to Stewart's statement, the Base Information Officer at CFB Comox replied tersely that no military operation is taking place. So, by the summer of 2001, pictures of contrails were being circulated by the Associated Press, and the word chemtrails could be overheard in coffee shop conversations across the continent. And of course then, so the big boys got into action, and U.S. Senator Colonel Walter Welsbach, chief of the Congressional Inquiry Division for the Secretary of the Air Force in Washington, D.C., called chemtrails a hoax. I had to do that initially. They always tell you not to believe what you're saying. And he blamed the increased number of contrails on significant civil aviation growth in the past decade. And the author goes on to say he's right on that score. National Science Foundation found that in certain heavily trafficked corridors, artificial cloud cover has increased by as much as 20%. Well, I wouldn't fall for that so easily. I mean, they're also spraying out of many, many planes. However, it says here that officials' denials reached new altitudes of absurdity when another colonel claimed the U.S. Air Force does not conduct spraying operations over populated areas. But he forgot about all the tankers they sprayed in overpopulated areas in Vietnam when they sprayed Agent Orange over the whole darn place. So meanwhile, the internet was abuzz with chemtrail conspiracy theories, yada, yada, yada. So this goes through the history of chemtrails. And then it goes into the Welsbach patents. Welsbach it's called. In 1994, the Hughes Aerospace Company was issued a remarkable patent, the Welsbach patent for reduction of global warming, proposed countering global warming by dispensing microscopic particles of aluminum oxide and other reflective materials into the upper atmosphere. The sky shield would reflect 1 or 2% of incoming sunlight. The patent suggested that tiny metal flakes could be added to the fuel of jet airliners so that particles could be emitted from the jet engine exhausts while the airliner was at cruising altitude. Computer simulations by Ken Caldera at California's Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory calculated that employing Welsbach's clinical sunscreen technology could stop global warming over 85% of the planet, despite an anticipated doubling of atmospheric carbon within the next 50 years. This is LLNL estimated the cost of creating this so-called sky shield at $1 billion a year, a cheap fix to avoid threatening the massive profits of the oil industry. Now, by the way, I think University of Alberta put out a study too, I have it here somewhere, where they say it would cost about $5 billion. I guess that's just for Canada. At the 1998 International Seminar on Planetary Emergencies, Edward Teller, the father of the H-bomb, presented his next big idea, Taylor called for spreading reflective chemicals over the Earth to act like a mirror shade. If it was impossible to protect the entire planet, these chemical sky shields could at least be extended to cover allies who secretly agreed to allow this unprecedented geoengineering experiment be carried out over their territory. They actually called it the Open Skies Treaty. There's another one just for commercial craft, but there's another one for what they're doing. In the July-August 1998 Science and Technology Review, Taylor argued that the Sky Shield offered a more realistic option for addressing global warming than drastic cutbacks in CO2 emissions. When he was asked if the technology was being pursued, he says, to my knowledge, the answer is negative. In fact, the technology already exists and existed before that. In 1975, the US Navy patented a device for producing a powder contrail having maximum radiation scattering ability. The powder contained a mixture of 0.3 micron size titanium dioxide pigment particles coated with 0.0027 micron hydrophobic colloidal silica. Back with more on this after this break. Very important article. Hi folks, I'm back cutting through the matrix and talking about the chemtrails and basically how you're being managed, your minds are being managed, so you don't really think about them. It can be important after all if the media doesn't mention it, and if famous people don't come out and make a fuss of it, you won't think anything of it. That's what Brzezinski said. He said you'll only be able to talk and think about the things that are on the major media the next day. That's what you do. Most folk do. They talk about the previous day's news. If it's not in the news, it can't be important. Now, as I was on to say, this is in Canada again. In the spring of 1998, rain falling through heavy chemtrails over Espanola, Ontario. And I remember when that happens because it doesn't say it in here, but I know there was a lot of sickness in the area. They were coming in low and they're coming over the Great Lakes. And it was a deal the Canadian government had made with the US. The US jets were coming up, going low and spraying this stuff. Understand, Canadians really are guinea pigs. We were the first ones to do GM food. We didn't even know we were eating the stuff for 10 years. They kept it secret. That came out in the papers. Government makes a secret deal with Monsanto and kept it from the public for 10 years that we're even eating this stuff. Then they studied our health effects, you see. And they know it worked. It kills us. But anyway, here they were testing on the people on this little town of Espanola. It's not far from me, in Ontario. And it was found to contain concentrations of aluminum particles 7 times higher than permitted by Canadian health safety laws. Provincial health officers ordered tests after residents began complaining about, this is what you get with it. There's more to it than this. Severe headaches, chronic joint pain. It'll give you arthritis, a lot of people. Also gives you cramping in the muscles. Dizziness, sudden extreme fatigue, acute asthma attacks, even if you've never had asthma in your lives, and feverless flu-like symptoms. The results of the tests were not released. Now, however, it was more than that because there was also a massive increase in stillbirths amongst people and animals. The people going into the forest were noticing the deer were having stillbirths as well. But so were the women living there too. And it says the report of illness all came from residents inside a 50 square mile area who complained they'd been subjected to months of spraying by photo-identified, and it's true, I've seen the photographs, U.S. Air Force tanker planes, refueling planes. The USAF denied the intrusions, and the government in Canada shut up. On November the 18th, 1998, Canadian opposition party defence critic Gordon Earl petitioned Parliament on behalf of the people of Espanola, speaking out on behalf of Canada's new Democratic Party. He says over 500 residents of the Espanola area have signed a petition raising concerns over possible government involvement in what appears to be aircraft emitting visible aerosols. They found high traces of aluminum and quartz in particulate and rainwater samples. Remember, you're breathing all this stuff in and it gets through the lungs into the bloodstream. These concerns, combined with associated respiratory ailments, have led these Canadians to take action and seek clear answers from this government. The petitioners call upon Parliament to repeal any law that would permit the dispersal of military chaff, they call it chaff, or any cloud-seeding substances whatsoever by domestic or foreign military aircraft without the informed consent of the citizens of Canada thus affected. A Harvard School of Public Health team determined that particulates with a diameter less than 10 microns, which is 1/10 the thickness of a human hair, pose a serious threat to public health. Remember the other one was 0.3 microns, the stuff that we're spraying in the States. On April the 2nd, 2001, the New York Times warned these microscopic motes are able to infiltrate the tiniest compartments in the lungs and pass readily into the bloodstream and have been most strongly tied to illnesses and early death, particularly in people who are already susceptible to respiratory problems. On December the 14th, 2000, the New England Journal of Medicine reported that inhaling particulate matter of a size 10 microns or smaller leads to a 5% increased death rate within 24 hours of the spraying. That's what it means. Teller's sunscreen calls for spraying 10 million tons of talcum fine reflective particulates of 10 to 100 micron sizes. And then it says the Congress addresses the chemtrails. On October the 2nd, 2001, Representative Dennis Kucinich of Ohio introduced the Space Preservation Act of 2001, which called for the elimination of exotic weaponry from space. Amongst the weapons to be banned were weather modification weapons such as HARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, and chemtrails. Though H.R. 3616 was later amended to remove the section that would have banned chemtrails, the original bill acknowledged the existence of chemtrail technology remains on the pages of the congressional records. With chemtrails now officially admitted by the U.S. government, an even bigger trial was set to begin in the court of public opinion. And then it says chemtrails go global. Sightings of oddly lingering plumes, sometimes resembling rocket trails, are not confined to North America. Well, on leaving Italy in the summer of 1999, the U.S. Navy's Kitty Chastain sat in her hotel balcony and watched aerial grids being laid all day just offshore over the Bay of Naples. It all started at the same time, folks. In Spain, on April 27, 2000, the American tourist John Henricks dashed off a quick email from El Fiat of Internet, where we were surprised to see that the chemtrails are as bad here as they are anywhere, both in Mallorca and Barcelona. Add Sweden to the list. And it says chemtrail activity has been reported released in 14 allied nations, including Australia, Belgium, Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Holland, Ireland, Italy, New Zealand, Scotland, Sweden, and the United States. And then it says another scary scenario. According to the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, the only way to form artificial clouds in warm, dry air is to introduce enough particulates into the atmosphere to attract and accrete all available moisture into visible vapor. If repeated often enough, the resulting rainlessness haze can lead to drought. Drought, folks. Back with more after this break. Hi, folks. I'm back. We're cutting through the matrix and talking about chemtrails because it's so prevalent. It's so disgusting to be sprayed like bugs every darn day and watch folk getting sick, awfully sick. And I'll also put these links up tonight, remember, at cuttingthroughthematrix.com. when I upload. Now, also, another video I'll put up too is really a classic. It's really good, where there's a town ship in the States having a talk about chemtrails and the fact that so many of them are sick with barium, aluminum oxide, and strontium, and various other things. And it's interesting. You really watch it because first they bring on the school teacher, young one too, who probably just looked up, Wikipedia or something to get the new rubbish about it. And she gives you this, we have trace elements in most of these things in our bodies, yada yada. You can get it from glass making and working in the oil industry. Well, this guy came out afterwards who was really sick with it and says, I've had enough of this little school talk here. And he says he's just got his report back from his blood test and he's full of all these things, aluminum oxide, barium, strontium, and so on. And he says, and so are most of the folk in this town. He says, you're all sick, he says. And he really goes to town and starts talking about the chemtrails. He says, haven't you looked above your heads? It's what's coming down on you, etc., etc. Excellent little talk he gives. So I'll put this up tonight too and go through it. Just hang on for the teacher with a little, talking to 4-year-olds explanation, which is all she'll probably know, and not much at that. And he goes into the real higher stuff, and it's excellent. Very, very good. Also tonight too, I want to do this one here. It's an interesting one. And it's from the American Conservative. I don't care who puts out things, left wing, right wing, whatever they happen to be or pretend they are. It doesn't matter, but this is a good little article. It says, one can say without exaggeration that inflation is an indispensable means of militarism, said Ludwig von Mises. It says, without it, the repercussions of war and welfare become obvious much more quickly and penetratingly. War weariness would set in much earlier. This explains why American politicians have always resorted to the legalized counterfeiting of central banking to finance wars, the most expensive of all government programs. If citizens had a clearer picture of the true costs, they'd be more inclined to oppose non-defensive intervention and to force all wars to hastier conclusions. Government can finance war and everything else by only three methods, which is taxes, debts, and the printing of money. Taxes are the most visible and painful, followed by debt finance, which crowds out private borrowing, drives up interest rates, and imposes a double burden of principal and interest, plus the public have to pay off all the debts. Money creation, on the other hand, makes war seem costless to the average citizen, but of course there's no such thing as a free lunch. As a general rule, the longer a war lasts, the more centrally planned and government-controlled the entire economy becomes. Remember what Quigley said, not said, you can get more done in 5 years of war from a government perspective by taking over and intruding into all the lives of the citizenry and farming and everything, all business, than you can in 50 years of peace and propaganda. It says here, and it remains so to a degree after the war has ended. War is the health of the state, as Randolph Byrne famously declared, and the growth of the state means a decline in liberty and prosperity for the people who have to pay off the debts, not for the ones who cause it at the top, As Robert Higgs wrote in Crisis on Leviathan, amongst the effects of World War I were massive government collusion with organized special interest groups, the de facto nationalization of the ocean, shipping and railroad industries, the increased federal intrusion in labor markets, capital markets, communications and agriculture, and enduring changes in constitutional doctrines regarding conscription and governmental suppression of free speech. Inflationary war finance inevitably leads to calls for price controls, which inflict even greater damage on the private enterprise system by generating shortages of goods and services, which are falsely blamed on capitalism. The state uses this excuse to grant itself even greater central planning powers. You can see that's all happening now with Homeland Security taking over the food supply and everything else. Inflating the currency as a method of war finance is often the first step in the adoption of what is essentially economic fascism. It doesn't matter if you call it fascism, communism, I don't really care, it's all the same thing to me. Paper and printing, by the same people. Paper and printing were invented in China, but most American politicians were the first to use government paper money. It was adopted by the colonial government of Massachusetts in 1690. As Murray N. Rothbard wrote, the Massachusetts government was accustomed to launching plunder expeditions against the prosperous French colony in Quebec. The loot was typically used to pay mercenary soldiers, but when one of the expeditions failed and the soldiers threatened mutiny, the Massachusetts government printed 7,000 British pounds in paper notes to pay the troops. The government promised to redeem the paper money in gold or silver, but it took 40 years to do so. Meanwhile, the public was so suspicious of the notes that they depreciated by 40% in the first year. By 1740, every colony except for Virginia had followed Massachusetts' lead in issuing fiat paper money. The results were dramatic inflation, boom and bust cycles, and depreciated currency. During the Revolution, a form of centralized banking was adopted when the Continental Congress issued the Continental in 1775. Because it was not backed by anything of value, the Continental depreciated so severely it was virtually worthless by 1781. Not worth a Continental became a popular slang term. Some of the states attempted to deal with inflation caused by the massive printing of Continentals with price control laws. The predictive effect was shortages, and they were so severe that George Washington's army almost starved in a field in Pennsylvania. The situation became so desperate that the Continental Congress issued a resolution on June 4th, 1778, urging all the states to abolish their price control laws. Whereas it hath been found by experience that limitations upon the prices of commodities are not only ineffectual for the proposed purpose, but likewise productive of very evil consequences, resolved that it would recommend it to the several states to repeal or suspend all laws limiting, regulating, or restraining the price of any article. Within 3 months, the army was fairly well provided for as a direct result of this change in policy, writes Robert Schutinger and Eamon Butler in 40 Censures of Wage and Price Controls, How Not to Fight Inflation. That's the book. Despite the economic calamities caused by America's first foray into centralized control of the money supply, at the end of the Revolutionary War, the nation's first central bank, which was the Bank of North America, was created with defense contractor Congressman Robert Morris implanted as its president. Centralized banking might have been ruinous for the general public, but political insiders like Morris profited handsomely. The bank was given a monopoly license to issue paper currency, and it used most of its newly created money for loans to the central government. In so doing, it inflated its currency so rapidly that within 1 year, the market lost all confidence in the bank, and it was privatized. Alexander Hamilton was a real founding father of central banking, as the Federal Reserve Board declared in one of its publications. His Bank of the United States, which is called BUS, I guess they bust the cash away from you, established in 1791 after a momentous debate between Hamilton and Jefferson over its constitutionality, was partly intended to finance sudden emergencies like war, in Hamilton's own words. He rejected Washington and Jefferson's foreign policy of commercial relations with all nations, entangling alliances with none. Instead, he advocated a permanent military establishment complete with a large navy and standing army that would pursue imperial glory. That's what he called it, Hamilton. As historian Clinton Rossiter explains, Hamilton's overriding purpose was to build the foundations of a new empire. The war hawks, they talk a lot about that. Hamilton praised public debt as a blessing and complained to George Washington, he said, "We need a government of more energy." Jefferson, on the other hand, opposed both a large public debt and a national bank, arguing the perpetuation of debt has drenched the earth with blood. It's still going on, of course. A reference to the European monarchs' endless wars of conquest funded by public debts. And that's so true. It's still going on today. It's the same bunch actually running it. Hamilton's Bank of the United States ran up 72% inflation in its first 5 years and created such economic instability that its 20-year charter was not renewed by Congress in 1811. Then came the senseless War of 1812. There was no central bank, but the federal government still devised a way to monetize the war debt, encouraged the creation of dozens of private banks, then in 1814 declared a suspension of specie payment. That is, banks were not required to redeem their paper currency in gold or silver. Thus, under the direction of the U.S. Congress, banks were allowed to inflate their currencies at will for 2.5 years as a means of monetizing the war debt, thereby disguising the costs of the conflict to the public. Inflation during the war years averaged about 35%. This was exacerbated when the BUS, the bank, was resurrected in January 1817 and empowered to create a national paper currency, purchase public debt, and receive deposits of U.S. Treasury funds. Rothbard explained the politics in his histories of money and banking in the United States. And he says the second bank of the U.S. was pushed through Congress, particularly by Secretary of the Treasury Alexander J. Dallas, who was a wealthy Philadelphia lawyer and close friend counsel and financial associate of Philadelphia merchant and banker Stephen Girard, reputedly one of the two wealthiest men in the country. Girard was the largest stockholder of the first bank of the U.S., and during the War of 1812, Girard became a very heavy investor in the war debt of the federal government. As a way to unload its public debt, Girard began to agitate for a new Bank of the United States. The second Bank of the U.S. launched a spectacular inflation of money and credit, writes Rothbard, coupled with a great deal of fraud. It promptly created the Panic of 1819, the first real depression in American history. For the first time, there was large-scale unemployment in cities such as Philadelphia, where employment in the manufacturing of handicrafts fell from 9,700 persons in 1815 to only 2,100 in 1819. After nearly 20 years of inflation, fraud, political corruption, and boom and bust cycles caused by the second bank of the U.S., President Andrew Jackson vetoed the bill to recharter the bank in 1834, and it went out of business. But the Hamiltonian nationalists did not. They would wage a political crusade for the next 2 decades, 20 years, crusades, as a member of the Whig and Republican parties to inflict central banking on the nation once again. They finally succeeded during the Lincoln administration with the Legal Tender Act of 1862, which empowered the Secretary of the Treasury to issue paper greenbacks that were not redeemable in gold or silver. The National Currency Acts of 1863 and 1864 created a system of nationally chartered banks that could issue banknotes and supplied to them by the new comptroller of the currency. The Act also placed a 10% tax on competing state banknotes to drive them out of business and establish a federal monetary policy monopoly. The predictable effect was massive inflation, with the greenback dollars so devalued that within 1 year they were worth only 35 cents in gold. All of the negative economic effects of inflation, devaluation of private wealth, unfair redistribution of income from creditors to debtors, and hindrance to rational economic calculation damaged the Northern war effort, but not as much as that of the South. The North funded most of the war with public borrowing. The South funded most of its wartime expenditures by printing Confederate dollars. Consequently, inflation in the Confederacy averaged more than 2,200% per year. The nationalization of the money supply created an engine of inflation and a powerful lobbying force to advocate that it keep running. Northern manufacturers realized that during periods of inflation, domestic currency tends to depreciate faster than prices are rising. A falling dollar makes domestic goods cheaper and the price of imports higher. Henceforth, it became a powerful political force in favor of an even further centralization of banking. Meanwhile, the heavily indebted railroads realized that inflation cheapened their debts, so they allied with manufacturers as a permanent lobby for inflation. And that's true in the railroads too, mind you, in Canada, the States, and elsewhere across the world, in the old empire, because it's an empire. I don't care if people think they're sovereign or not, it's been one empire. The big moguls, the Robert Barons, got all the land for the railroads for free, sometimes for miles on either side of the tracks as well. Plus, we paid for it all. It was first public-private partnership. They ended up owning it all. Not bad deals, eh? These special interests joined the political coalition that created the Federal Reserve Board in 1913, which became an important source of finance for America's disastrous participation in World War I 4 years later. Well, World War I was all planned, obviously. And in fact, Mandel House was in contact with Ed Graves. It was actually Lord Grey from Britain, who was a member of the Milner Group, who became the Royal Institute for International Affairs. And that was his contact, and they planned it themselves to get a central banking in and to get the wars going against Germany and so on, other countries. And then they brought the Warburg guys over. One of them came over. He was only in the country about 2 years from Germany, and he was head of this brand new Federal Reserve. And his brother was the head of the banking for Germany. At the end of World War I, the two of them got together and discussed the debts all the countries owned. It's amazing. This is in your face, isn't it? The Fed did not just print greenbacks, as was the case during the Civil War. It printed enough money to purchase more than $4 billion in government bonds that were used to finance the war. The amount of money in circulation doubled between 1914 and 1920, as did prices. This was enormous hidden war tax on the American people. Wealth was cut in half along with real wages, and just about everything consumers purchased became more expensive. The boom created by the Fed's war financing eventually caused a bust, the Depression of 1920, the first year of which was even worse than the first year of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Gross domestic product declined by 24% from 1920 to 21, while the number of unemployed Americans more than doubled from 2.1 million to 4.9 million. The Great Depression of 1920 only lasted 1 year, however, thanks to President Warren Harding's inspired policy of cutting both government spending and taxes dramatically. In the wars that have followed, central bank financing has inflicted essentially the same kind of damage on American society: inflation, economic chaos, reduced real wages, price controls, and other government interventions, and ideological attacks on capitalism rather than the real culprit, which is the Fed. Adam Smith recognized the advantage of financing wars with taxes rather than public debt when he wrote, "Wars would in general be more speedily concluded and less wantonly undertaken. The people feeling during the continuance of a war the complete burden of it, the cost of it, would soon grow weary of it, and the government, in order to humor them, would not be under the necessity of carrying it on longer than it was necessary to do so. Central bank inflation renders the cost of war even more invisible than debt financing does, and is therefore even more disastrous for the American people." So that's how it's run, folks. You're run by crooks, you see. But money's run by crooks. It's always been run by crooks. Definitely the central banking system, for sure. And you understand that the central banking system was designed, as I say, by the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and on behalf of the guys who already run the Bank of England and a few other central banks already across Europe. And now there's an article in the paper today about Barroso too is talking about the amalgamation of all the private banking systems into one massive bank under the Bank for International Settlements, which is right out of the agenda of Carl Quigley, who was a historian for the Council on Foreign Relations, which is just the American branch of the Royal Institute for International Affairs. So we're really living a script, you understand, a big plan script. And people really think they're free too. They keep talking about this, planning about this thing called democracy. They've never had democracy. Never had it, you know. You can only have like a democracy when you're a common culture. Even the Club of Rome that works for the United Nations and these big bankers who help plan all of this system said there's too many competing factions. You know, people who want to change genders, not what's special, right? Everybody's conflicting. Thousands of groups would all fight each other. Understand that? It's already happening. Back with more after this break. Hi folks, I'm back cutting through the matrix and talking about the big system we live in. Most folk believe it's all real because it was already there when they were born and they never questioned it. And most people in their peer group never questioned it either. This article came out and a little part of the article takes another article from the Jerusalem Post, and it says, in an apparent reference to the public spat between the US and Israel, former Israeli Defense Force Chief of Staff Gabi Ashkenazi told the Calculist on conference on Tuesday that preserving strong ties with the US is an Israeli security necessity. He says we must preserve ties with the US. I believe this is a security necessity. And in the past 3 years, he said, US taxpayers have contributed more to the Israeli defense budget than Israeli taxpayers. Since 2009, that amount is more than $11 billion. That's not including all the weapons they sent over recently, all the missiles and so on. Explaining why money needs to be stolen from US taxpayers and given to the only nuclear state in the Middle East. Despite the fact that Israeli leaders work directly sometimes against US interests, especially when they try to pressure them to launch discretionary wars. And it's getting harder even for hawks to do in the US. So I'll put this link up tonight as well. Because we're living in quite some times indeed, and it's really in your face now. It's all really in your face. Also, a great article too, and it's called Unprecedented. The Economic Union, this new Soviet of the whole of Europe, the officials call on fellow countries, all the countries, to give up complete control of their banks. It says European officials are asking national governments to give up control of their banks as a means of solving the EU's financial crisis that their central banking system got them into. It's meant to get them into it so that they can give up all the other banks and only have the big central banks running the show, the whole of Europe. And it says in a proposal that represents one of the most significant surrenders of national sovereignty since the creation of the euro in 1999. That's the money system, the euro cash system. The European Commission, the EU's executive arm, proposed Wednesday to make the European Central Bank the single supervisor for all 6,000 banks in the 17 countries that use the currency. Now that was exactly what Quigley talked about in the 60s, since he was the historian for the bunch, the CFR, Royal Institute for International Affairs. They've been running the world for well over 100 years. And he said in it that eventually they'll bring in a one banking system, which they'll own themselves, because it's money boys who own the Royal Institute for International Affairs. They set it up. And he also said that they would be under the supervision of the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. All of this is in this article. The history of it, by the way, is in this article, quite a lot of the history. Well worth watching, going through. And is quite fascinating. Lots of links and so on. And you'll hear all the different characters in Brussels talking about world government and all the rest of it, a super world currency, yada yada. We're dead on target with everything that was planned and quickly talked about that a long time ago, the Anglo-American establishment, etc. That's what they call it in one of his books. You got to read that to understand what's happening today, because we're living a script, a long-term business plan. That's what it is. And the other side of it too was to alter drastically all cultures, destroy the family unit that have no opposition, nobody would stand up for anybody anymore, and then destroy the cultures totally under the guise of multiculturalism, which is no culture at all. It's already happened, folks. It's already happened. And most folk have adapted into it without thinking. That's how it is. So, from Hamish and myself, from heavily sprayed by chemtrail sky in Ontario, Canada, it's good night to me, your God or your gods go with you.